Reactive Training Systems.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the RTS podcast. I'm Mike Tushir, and I'm here today with John Garfano and Dr. Pack, which you go by just Pack.
I go by just Pack, yes. And the Dr. Pack is just for social media purposes and for jokes. Hey, is there a doctor in the room? Yes, but Doctor of Philosophy.
All right. Yeah, okay. So I think maybe the best place for us to start, because we're going to get into conversation on training and minimum training dose and deloads and lots of cool stuff. But before we get to the good stuff, maybe just to introduce yourself to our audience that maybe isn't so familiar with how did you get to be in this position where you are now conducting research on lifting of all?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Pack. My actual name is Patroklos Androulakis Korakakis. So Pack is essentially not the anagram, but the first letters of my name and two surnames because one long Greek surname was not enough. I am a researcher over here at the UK at Solent University, and I also do some lecturing. But I work full-time as a coach for StrongerByScience.com, working with powerlifters, physique athletes, as well as recreationally active individuals of all sporting and professional backgrounds, anywhere from military personnel to teachers, doctors, real doctors, not my kind of doctor, physicians, if I may. And I got into research for powerlifting when I was around the age of 22, right when I was finishing my bachelor's degree. I chose a topic around powerlifting and high-intensity interval training for my dissertation back then. And then, because I enjoyed everything that had to do with research and just looking into powerlifting, after I had a sneak peek behind the curtain, I saw that, hey, there's not actually much research out there. I initially thought, hey, a lot of the common knowledge that was out there in terms of powerlifting, and you mentioned deloads as well, we'll get to that in a second. I realized that a lot of it is more common belief rather than, hey, set in stone knowledge. And I started doing research pro bono. I told my supervisor back then, Dr. James Steele, that, hey, I have a year where I'm not studying. I'd like to do some research. And then I got into a research project where I looked at lower back strength in competitive and non-competitive powerlifters versus recreationally active individuals, which then slowly gave birth to the idea of a PhD. And the PhD, I'm not going to bore you with the whole story, but essentially ended up being around the minimum dose for 1 RM strength. So what's the least a powerlifter needs to do for 1 RM strength? In the meantime, there were many other projects that came about. And in general, even though research is not my profession, as in I don't make a living off of research, I enjoy putting out 2, 3, 4, how many ever projects we can and how many ever projects time allows per year, along with other collaborators around strength and sometimes physique sports, but mostly strength sports and most importantly, powerlifting, because I enjoy it and I think it helps the community as much as it does.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with you there. So was there something specific that drew you to powerlifting? I assume that you were lifting and perhaps competing yourself at that point.
I was, but funny enough, I stopped right before my PhD. So I got into powerlifting around 2014, 2015. And even though I had fun competing, I've competed like 4 times or so. I was never an exceptional powerlifter or anything like that. I realized at some point that I mostly enjoy lifting rather than powerlifting, and my passion for the sport itself was not enough to fuel a competitive career. Or I always looked for an excuse to do off-season quote unquote training. I wanted to do hypertrophy training, so I was just trying to justify it. But at some point you can only justify so many tricep extensions and lateral raises as a powerlifter. And I decided that, hey, I don't need to have a specific identity. I can just be somebody who enjoys lifting, who chases 1 RM PRs on certain lifts, who overhead presses instead of bench presses, and still do research in powerlifting because I loved the sport as a sport. And I also really enjoyed the coaching side of things. So when I started coaching, I enjoyed being a guy behind the scenes, learning. So my researcher side enjoyed the research, but I also viewed the coaching as well, in the sense that, hey, if you've worked like yourselves, if you worked with multiple athletes, that data, even though it's not a controlled, randomized controlled trial and must be viewed with caution, it still allows you to better understand strength, performance, especially if you're working with all kinds of people. So it was the coaching for powerlifting that became more of an identity rather than the power lifter, and that tied in with the research.
Yeah. I can relate to that as well in terms of just finding other things in the gym that you care about that are still performance related, like powerlifting adjacent. In fact, I wish, just put this idea out there for anybody, I'll never get to it, but but I wish someone would come up with a sport that's, think of it like strongman, but using regular gym equipment. So wouldn't it be fun to compete in a sport that's, I don't know, tricep extensions, 10% or 20% of body weight, as many reps in 2 minutes or something like that? That could be one of the events, and it change at each competition. Maybe you've got one comp that's a heavy comp, and then other comps are light comps. So you see, maybe
That's a really
that.
good point. Yeah.
Let's add another event to the Arnold.
Yeah. Man, I think this is a good idea. Somebody needs to figure this out.
Because I get guilt every time I mention a PR that is not SBD. So, because I have my friends, a lot of my friends are pure powerlifters. And when I rock up with a, hey, lat pull down personal best or PR, they're like, it's cool, bro. Who cares? It's not SBD. We don't care about your preacher curl PR or your leg press PR.
I feel that John can attest to this. I would talk about that when I was doing the front squats a lot, that I would hit these front squat, like I hit front squat goals and then chase them down just the same way that you would anything else. It was meaningful to me, but I would joke about, yeah, I care about this, but no one else in the world cares at all.
I cared about your front squats. They were insane.
I did think at the time, because there was this one period of time where there were a handful of people that were front squatting some pretty ridiculous ones. Like, wouldn't it be fun to invite everybody out to my garage and we all like front squat in the garage and call it the Front Squat World Championship? Yeah, anyway, so I definitely got off track there, but I definitely think that's a cool aspect of your own training and totally relatable too on how that could connect back into passion for coaching the sport of powerlifting, thing that like how it kind of connects into your research as well. So your actual, was this like pre-PhD, the look into low back strength differences between populations?
Yes, this was a project that, so we have a sports science lab, obviously, at the Solent University, and we have access to a Medix lumbar extension machine, essentially a machine that restricts your pelvis. I'll send you a picture so you can visualize it, and essentially isolate your lower back completely. And you can, depending on your range of motion, which will be dictated by how big you are, we can bend you up to 72 degrees, and then we isometrically tested at different angles. So we got powerlifters, competitive and non-competitive, recorded a bunch of stuff about them. So whether they deadlifted sumo, conventional, whether they used a belt, other lower back exercises, whether they used PEDs because they were not all IPF lifters, whether they used wraps, and so on. And because I wanted it to be as ecologically valid as possible, because hey, if we didn't know if they deadlifted sumo or conventional, that could potentially affect results. Anyways, I'm blabbering here. And what we did is we compared their lower back strength. So we tested them at different angles based on the range of motion. And we compared that strength to a previous study that was done by our own group, where they had looked at lower back strength in after an intervention where people did Romanian deadlifts. So they did Romanian deadlifts for some time, for I think 10 weeks, and then they tested their lower back strength on the machine. The interesting thing was that the hypothesis that was formed after that research was when they had two groups. So that's before our own study. One group was training on the machine. So on that machine, you can also train not just isometrically, but you can rep out the weight, full range of motion. And they trained on the machine and got tested on the machine and the RDL. So one group just did machine training and the other group did RDL training. The group that did just RDLs got better at RDLs, but didn't see any increases on isolated lumbar extension strength. The group that trained just on the machine saw increases in both RDL and isolated lumbar extension strength, despite not training the RDL. Now, obviously, that was just one study, right? So it could have been completely by chance. It could be the fact that maybe they rested a bit more and they then peaked. It could be whatever. But I found that interesting, and I was like, okay, let's take a bunch of powerlifters, including some guys that were pretty strong, and see how they compare to that group, to the scores that the RDL group had post-intervention. And what I found interesting, even though I didn't expect it, I expected the powerlifters to completely wipe them. There was not much difference in terms of isolated lumbar extension strength between powerlifters and that group. Keep in mind, both groups were pretty strong, right? But it may be that after a certain point, the compound lifts, because obviously there's a lot of musculature involved, and it's not just the lower back, it's your lower back may peak at some point, its strength potential, and then it's just glutes and hamstrings that take over. Or it may be that on that particular machine, that's the amount of strength it can express. It could be completely random as well. So a huge asterisk, and next to the results, it doesn't mean that, hey, the powerlifts don't train your lower back. It may mean that after a certain point, you may need to actually stabilize your pelvis, restrict your pelvis, and do some isolation work for your lower back.
So what's your sense of it from a powerlifting coaching standpoint? So like, you know about this as a researcher and probably in more intimate detail than most. So what do you do with that knowledge when it comes to your coaching practice?
So the answer is not going to be a very sexy answer, because the answer is not much. At the moment, it's very early data, which we haven't followed up with another study. It would be really cool to see. It would have an actual practical application if we did an intervention study where we got competitive powerlifters, had them train on the machine, and then see what transfer that has to their 1RM strength. Because again, it may have been that the 2 testing sessions we did, because there was a familiarization session, but it may have been that if they trained 5 times on the machine, they would get much better at using the machine, and they would blow recreational lifters out the water. So at the moment, it hasn't really influenced my coaching. It was an interesting study, but people tend to view studies, especially people that want to draw practical conclusions from them. They want that yes or no answer. They want, okay, what do I do with this? Is it better? Were they worse? And it was just a study that, hey, added a small pebble to our knowledge about the lower back strength and powerlifting, but there's still much more to discover.
Yeah, definitely. I think that my sense of it is that people who are involved in research directly can get very conservative with how they talk about the impact of that research. And that's understandable and ideal even. But then there comes this question of potential utility. And I think that sometimes people that are close to it, they may notice something. Like you said, they did rest in a day or two, and I just kind of get a feeling that has something to do with it. And stuff like that may not always come out in the write-up, but have a sense of things, especially like when this research meets your coaching experience. And I just think of this interesting intersection that it's kind of like if you go to a doctor, real doctor, and they present you with a few options, and they say, if it was my kid, then I would do this. And that always kind of carries a bit different weight than here's the raw statistics, make your choice.
For sure. The one limitation with this particular paper is the use of the machine. So if gyms had an isolated lumbar extension machine, like the Medics, and it was the medical version of the Medics, which is very rare even for like people to locate in general, I would say, hey, give it a try. Go train, restrict your pelvis, give that type of training a go as a lower back accessory. But I'm so limited by the fact that nobody can use this machine, or potentially they could somewhat replicate it, but then that would be a limitation of its own, where I can't say, hey, find a sports science lab and try to get in and then use the machine. But if somebody had access to it, that could be a potential accessory exercise for their squat and deadlift strength.
What's interesting?
Sorry, go ahead, John.
I was going to jump in and say what's interesting too is that I've actually been seeing a lot of powerlifting coaches talk about the 45-degree back extension, back raise, and how beneficial it has been for their coaching practice for their lifters. There seems to be a lot of conversation around that recently that I'm seeing. And I think it's at least interesting to try it, right? To say the go-to on strengthening glutes and hips in general is going to be an RDL, right? That's pretty much a staple. How often are we programming like weighted hyperextensions? And one of the barriers, I think, actually to entry around that is a lot of people training at home. How do you do it? Right? What do you set up? How do you get it heavy enough that actually provides a challenge in a situation like that where you can lock your hips in? And I do think that your research is, at least it's important to pose another question and to help us to continue looking at it, because there's some anecdotes from the field of people getting really good success from training that movement and training it heavy. And there's some question marks from your study, some things that haven't been tested. And like, for example, like what if you didn't use something that was so expensive and out of touch for most people and you did just a regular 45-degree back extension, right? There's some problems with that too, right? Like it's not uniform, doesn't really isolate things very well, but what if you train that, and how does that carry over to a 1RM?
That's a great point. And I'm a big believer, especially in the world of powerlifting, I'm a big believer in looking at some of the observations that we as coaches make and other coaches make. I think there's a lot of value in that, obviously with some caution and not taking everything as a common fact. But those studies, unfortunately, the reality is that they're hard to come. And I did them, for example, because I just wanted to do them. I said, hey, let me do a study. And it's highly unlikely that we're going to see a lot of paid research on ILEX strength and powerlifting. But there was another paper called Associations Between Trunk Extension Endurance and Isolated Lumbar Extension Strength in Both Asymptomatic Participants and Those with Low Back Pain. And they found that trunk extension endurance was not a good indicator of strength in that particular machine, which was also, it made things even more complicated. From my standpoint, I was expecting to see powerlifters get in that machine, absolutely break every record in the lab, and some of them did, but yeah, it was strange that it wasn't exactly that way.
It reminds me that Fred Hatfield actually used it wasn't a 45 degree. It was like a full back raise machine, like GHR style, but he developed a device like this shoulder strap that would hang down in front of you, and then you'd wrap it around the bar like a pair of wrist straps. And he would use that to provide sufficient loading, so he wasn't grip limited when he was training on this before. But I thought that was pretty interesting as well. But again, it's one of those things that Fred did a lot of stuff, and some of it proliferated through the powerlifting community, and then some of it didn't. And I'm not sure exactly why. I do remember trying to get a hold of some of those shoulder straps, but being unable to do so. Could be something as simple as that.
We could. I can ask the lab if I heard they might want to get rid of the ILEX machine. If you wanted it shipped, it's probably
weighs, put it in the garage,
600 kilos or something. It's good that I can speak in kilos as well, which is great. But anyways, that whole project was just a one-off, hey, this would be cool to look at. Then we made the switch to the minimum dose research, which was the bread and butter of our research here with powerlifters.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that as well. I guess maybe let's start with a quick overview of what that was about and what you found.
Cool. That was essentially the entirety of my PhD. So what's the least a powerlifter can do and still get stronger? And the way the PhD was structured was this. We did a pilot study with powerlifters in Greece. So back in 2016, 2017, I had access to the Olympic weightlifting hall in Athens, the one that Piros Dimas trained in as well sometimes. And we had a powerlifting team there, trained there. I lived in the UK still, but whenever I went back to Greece, I trained there. And they had organized a powerlifting team, and there was a coach who was a good personal friend and also a fellow strength geek. And we thought, hey, this is an ideal sort of setup to run a short-term study and look at stuff, because the guys were training there for free. They were getting coached for free. They were inclined to potentially participate in studies as well, in at least one study. And we said, hey, let's look at what's the least or how low we can push training volume and still see some sort of improvement, or see what the effect of that will be. And what we did for the pilot study was we had powerlifters who were preparing for competition train with as low as 1 repetition per week, 1 single repetition at RPE 9 to 9.5, twice per week for the squat, 3 times per week for the bench, and once per week for the deadlift. And they trained 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, ideally. Obviously, there were a couple of times where that had to change. And they did squat, bench on Monday, deadlift, bench on Wednesday, and then squat, bench on Friday. And all they did was one set of 1 rep, obviously their warm-ups as well, at RP 9 to 9.5. And then the other group did a sort of traditional, quote-unquote, periodized powerlifting protocol, because they were both preparing for the Greek national competition at the time for the Greek IPF affiliate. So the setup was quite ecologically valid, like powerlifters preparing for a competition. Obviously, one group did a very unorthodox protocol. And what we saw was that we only had 8 people participate in that study, originally 10, but 2 dropped out. And we saw that the group that was doing the singles, peri-training, so during their training, 4 out of 5 participants managed to see an increase in their total, around 20 to 30 kilos. During competition day, only 2 saw an increase in their total, while 2 saw a decrease and 1 no change. And keep in mind that was a pilot study, so we were just testing things out, seeing if it makes sense for us to research this further. But the peri-intervention data, as well as the competition data, hinted at, hey, there may be a bit more here to unpack, because 1 repetition per week for the deadlift, I think it's not even low volume, it's insanely low volume. And that's all they did. So after that study, that study essentially gave birth to the PhD, and I went ahead and did a few more studies. We did another couple of intervention studies where at that time we had more powerlifters as well. We had 16 powerlifters in one. They did 8 of them. So one group did the exact same training protocol as the group doing the singles from the pilot study, so the super low volume training protocol. And the other group did the exact same plus 2 backup sets of 3 at 80% of whatever they hit for their top single that day. It's great to speak with people that understand these numbers off the bat, because I've been on podcasts that are not powerlifting friendly, and I always feel like I'm saying too many numbers, and I can see both of you here like, yeah, okay, got it. What we did
Monday.
Yes, indeed. So we had those 2 groups, and the way we analyzed our data was this. Instead of performing inferential statistics and telling you, hey, there was a statistically significant difference between groups or whatever, what we did is we asked powerlifting coaches and athletes, we asked them what they regard as a meaningful strength change for SBD and total over 6 weeks, because that study was 6 weeks. The pilot study was 10 weeks, I forgot to mention. So we asked powerlifting coaches and athletes, hey, what do you regard as a meaningful change in 6 weeks? And in order to make sure that data was not, hey, because we could have just asked some random powerlifting coaches and athletes that said numbers that are not realistic. So what we did is we compared with the data from the Open Powerlifting .org database, and we saw how much does one need to move up one place in an IPF international competition. And we compared the data with what the coach and athletes said is a meaningful increase, and they were relatively close. So that sort of fact check that, hey, what they said was not unrealistic. We asked around 137 people. So what we did to analyze the data from the 6-week intervention is we calculated the probability that the strength change of each group falls within what the coaches and athletes regarded as meaningful. So I'll just speak about total changes in their powerlifting total rather than taking each powerlift separately. Obviously, if you want me to clarify more, please let me know. But the group that did just the singles had a 6% chance to see increases that were further than what the powerlifting coaches and athletes regarded as meaningful. So relatively low probability. And they had a 13% chance to be within what they regarded as meaningful. Their total change, their, let's say, average, the huge asterisk change in total in 6 weeks was around 11.5 kilos. So the group that did the backup sets, though, so they did the singles and then followed with 2 sets of 3, exact same frequency, exact same arrangement, they had a 99% chance to experience strength gains greater than what the powerlifting coaches and athletes regarded as meaningful, and 1%, a 10% chance of being, a 1% chance so 10% chance of being within what they regard as meaningful. And which was extremely interesting. Now, obviously, keep in mind there are plenty of limitations because pre and post testing in any population, if I grab you, John, and we go next week and test your 1RM strength, and then make you follow a very low volume protocol with heavy loads that is very specific to 1RM testing, you may see like a 20, 30 kilo total increase, but it may not even be a PR. But in those 6 weeks, it will still be an increase. So keep in mind a lot of limitations, but that was super interesting. We also then did another intervention study where we had the same group with the back off sets and a group that was doing an AMRAP set at 70% of their 1RM at RPE 9 to 9.5. And we found that the group that did the AMRAP set had a 40% chance of exceeding what the coaches and athletes regarded as meaningful, around 15 kilos over 6 weeks, their total. 3.4 being the minimum, 31 being the maximum, 26% chance of being within what the coaches and athletes regard as meaningful. And then the group that did the back off sets, so the singles and back off sets, again, did really well. They had a 98% chance of exceeding what the coaches and athletes regard as meaningful with an average change of 26.8 kilos and around a 6% chance of being within what they regarded as meaningful. Now, you may say, hey, Pac, that's all cool and stuff. You're talking about 16 and 8 powerlifters and 9, sorry. So you're talking about 25 powerlifters here. That's a very low sample. And I'll say, yes, I completely agree. And that's why we also did an interview study where we spoke with coaches and athletes, some of the best coaches in the world. I cannot reveal any names because they were confidential and I didn't ask if I can use their names, but they are certain people that we may all know. But joking aside, we asked a bunch of coaches and athletes with a lot of experience. So having worked with multiple IPF world champions, some of the athletes that we spoke to had and still have all-time world records in bench, deadlift, and total. So just to give you an idea, the female athletes that we spoke to had mean total of 460 kilos, plus or minus 58, and the males had a mean total of 750 kilos, plus or minus 38 kilos. The coaches that we spoke to had a total of around 3,600 athletes coached. Obviously, that was quite rough, but they had worked with hundreds of national champions and at least 30 IPF world champions. The reason I'm mentioning the characteristics of the sample, I think it's important it's important because we have a lot of powerlifting coaches, and just the word powerlifting coach may not necessarily reflect a valid opinion on what the minimum dose could be. So it was important to speak with people that have worked with athletes of all kinds of levels, but also with high level athletes. And I'm not going to go through the whole analysis that we did on their interviews, but essentially what we found was that a very common theme that they expressed was that 1 to 5 heavy repetitions, so a few high load sets per week of 1 to 5 repetitions for 6 to 12 weeks may be enough to meaningfully increase the strength of a powerlifter. That was the gist of what came out of the interviews. There were a few other things that we looked at in terms of the concept of the minimum dose, but I'll not get into many of those details. And last but not least, we also did a systematic review and meta-analysis where we looked at the current literature on the minimum dose. Would you like to guess how many studies existed on powerlifters and like single set training?
Had to be close to none.
Yes. Bingo. It was 0. So then we had to look at like resistance trained individuals. And studies that included either squat, bench, or deadlift. And we found 6, like we're talking about big data here, 6 whole studies. And out of looking at those and meta-analyzing them, we found that 1 to 3 sets performed close or to failure per week with loads ranging from 75 to 85% 1RM may be enough to significantly increase 1RM strength in resistance trained men. There was no data on women, and there was also no data on the deadlift. So any study we found either included the squat or the bench press or both. But yeah, that was the project overall. And like too long didn't read conclusion is essentially powerlifting athletes looking to train with a minimum dose approach can do so by performing around 3 to 6 working sets of 1 to 5 repetitions per lift each week, with these sets spread across to 1 to 3 sessions per power lift, using loads around above 80% and around an RPE of 7.5 to 9.5 for around 6 to 12 weeks, and expect to gain some strength.
No, I guess to just kind of jump right into thoughts and reactions here. If you had to look at my career through ascribe a theme, it would be the individualization of training. That's kind of the question that I keep coming back to, and the process that I'm trying to optimize for it. But as a result of that, we have lots of different athletes. We tend to maybe even attract athletes that have non-standard training responses, which is well enough, that's fine. But we've definitely seen some people who gravitate toward programs that are a lot lower volume than what we would think would be effective. And even to the point where it kind of surprises us, John. I know that you've had a few that have surprised you as well by just how low we need to go to see some positive adaptations. And it's got to be eye-opening to the powerlifting community in general, especially like in this era of pushing more toward volume. I think probably since 2015 or so, we've been on this trajectory of very volume focused. And that seems to be swinging back in the other direction now. I think it's in full swing back the other direction, that we pretty commonly recognize at this point that volume isn't the only thing that matters. And there are certainly situations where more is not better. So would you say that's been a common reaction, is maybe a bit of surprise, but okay, I can see like how, I don't know, I guess maybe I should just leave it as an open question. What's the reaction that you tend to get when people see like how low volume can still be effective?
That's a really interesting question, because there was one study I didn't mention because it doesn't hold as much weight. We did a survey study with national level power lifters where they had provided evidence that they were actually competitors at the national level or international level in the IPF, just to get an insight in people that may have played around with the concept before. And one of the questions was, obviously, have you played around with a minimum dose approach before? And a lot of people said no. And they said, hey, I want optimal results. 40% said I want optimal results. 30% said I hadn't thought of that before. 30% said, because they were able to select responses, they said, I don't want to experiment and risk potential progress. But what was interesting was 91% said, I would consider occasionally utilizing a minimum effective draining dose approach if there was more evidence around its effectiveness and overall utility, which was really cool to see. And I think that's where the project helped a bit. Keep in mind that there were a few people that treated this with surprise and were like, oh, wow, I could go as low as this. And others came out and said, oh, that's really cool. I've actually played with this concept before. And I found that, yeah, that's what I did. I actually did singles for a busy period of my life, or when I had my first kid or whatever. And I was surprised that back then it had worked relatively well. And I managed to hit a few PRs, or at least slightly increase my strength. So yeah, there was a mixed response to answer your question, but it's just not the sexiest of concepts. Hey, what's the least you can do? And at least for some people, for me, it's quite sexy, even though I never trained that way. It's really cool to see, hey, how low can we push a training and still see a meaningful piece?
It's good just to have that conversation. I think this is a mentality that we struggle with as coaches all the time, and even as athletes. This is something that I fight against for myself as an athlete, is this continual drive to always push toward doing more. You can know that factually in your head that, hey, more is not always better. And yeah, you're going through a busy period of life, and actually doing less is going to take you to a better place in the long run. You can know that, but it's still difficult to act on it. And I think it kind of brings back to memory that there's different kinds of knowledge, and just like knowing the facts. Like, if you're going to go jump off of a high dive, you may know what to do, and you may know with reasonable certainty, like, this is a thing that people do and that they're fine afterwards and it's not a big deal, you're still nervous. And that becomes a difficult thing to not act on, if that makes sense. So I can sympathize with maybe a bit of reluctance to go in that direction, or understand why we haven't explored that territory before. But it's good to have that kind of conversation because it does get people thinking about it and provides a little bit more comfort to go in that direction when that's appropriate.
Yeah, exactly. And that was a big takeaway for me personally as a coach, that hey, I've had people who I still have people who are extremely busy and at the same time have very stressful lifestyles and are also very strong. And pounding them with volume sometimes is the right thing to do. Other times it's just not possible. And from a psychological standpoint as well, having a lifter not complete sessions and report that, hey, I missed out on the 3 accessory exercises or couldn't do all the back of sets, and repeatedly having to actually write down that they did not finish a session and see that they've left fields on our sheet incomplete. I think that creates a sort of a negative environment where, even though the few heavy sets they've done might have been relatively productive, then the fact that they still got something in was great, because they're looking at a program that still has a few boxes that need to be checked. They leave thinking, oh, okay, this was a bad training week. And when we reframe that, when we take a step back and say, hey, let's actually try only doing a few heavy sets and a few back of sets on just SBD, and this is our program now. It will look the simplest program on paper, but this is all you need to complete, and as long as you complete it, that's a session well done. And that, I think, that can offer tremendous help in those periods for those lifters.
Yeah. That's a thing that I've done to myself as well. It's like writing that's maybe over optimistic for the level of demand that you've got. Believe and like, and it's one thing like if you understand, oh, I got these things done, they're the most important thing. But the psychological environment is, and the more coaching experience I gained, the more I think that's underappreciated. That feeling like you win in the training session seems like an important thing. And I don't know how you would begin to measure something like that and provide evidence for that. But setting up the training session in a way that takes the client's constraints seriously and facilitates a win at the end of that session, I think is really important.
I wanted to ask you guys a question on the minimum dose concept, but go ahead.
I was just going to add, I think too, because I've dabbled with minimum dose training before, and one of the things that I noticed about it is that it can work incredibly well. It's actually one of my favorite strategies for my squat, not for deadlift, not for bench, but for squat. It's just fantastic. And I've been in pinches before where I've needed to do that. Tried a strategy, didn't really work. Well, got a comp coming up in 4 weeks. What do, and you reach back and you pull back from some of your greatest hits and you can use some of those things. So it's good to experiment with some of this stuff because you never know when you're going to be in a situation where you might want to use it. And it's good to have some of those playbooks, some of those plays that you can pull out of the playbook to use. One of the things I've observed in myself and then also athletes where we've had constraints, we've had to do it, is that there's a shelf life to it, right? So there's a point at which it stops. And for some people, it's a cliff, right? Like you just saw 20 kilo increase in your squat. You're feeling so good. And then right off that cliff. And that's the way that it goes. And for some people, it's a slow burn. It just slowly gets worse over time. I wonder, in your research, did you happen to ask athletes prior to the intervention and after? So prior, what were you doing prior to the minimum dose intervention? And then it'd be very interesting afterward what people did. Because that's always one of the challenges. If you look at Zordos's like daily 1RM research, and he's talked about this openly, what do you do after?
Yeah.
Right. Like, how do you go into something else? And what does that look like? It becomes very difficult to then think about pivoting to a new strategy.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And it's an excellent observation as well. And on the pilot study where it was slightly longer, so it was 10 weeks, we thought maybe 10 weeks was a bit too much. And that's why we then did the 6-week studies, because we were like, okay, let's look at it in 6 weeks, where because peri training during the pilot study was around the 5 to 7 week mark where they saw peri increases. But anecdotally speaking, from my coaching as well, there's definitely, like the way you put it, like there's an expiry date. Like at some point, yeah, okay, you did your singles and back of sets or just your singles, did great for a few weeks, but at some point you need to do something else or a bit more. We did not ask powerlifters. We told them, hey, you can only participate in the study if you haven't done a single, like a similar type of training before, like before as in before the study. But we asked them to rate how much they enjoyed the training and how easy it was to adhere to the training protocol, how manageable it was, and their perceived effectiveness, and how likely they were to use a similar protocol. So the group that did just the singles rated that around a 3 out of 5. So extremely likely, 5 being extremely likely, 0 being extremely unlikely. And the group that did the backoffs and the singles was slightly higher than that. So the response was relatively neutral. I think people like, and as Mike mentioned, being close to the research, a few people told me, hey bro, I'm getting tired of the singles and backoff sets during the 5th week, especially, but because they had just one more week to go or 2 weeks to go, they pushed through it. But yeah, overall the response was neutral in terms of enjoyment, and in terms of utilizing such an approach before, they were also relatively neutral, which is not a bad thing. When we asked them if they were likely to use such an approach during a busy period of time, the scores were higher, so they were closer to 4 rather than 3, which was again interesting to see. But it would be really interesting to get the data. So now that you said it, I felt a bit bad that we didn't ask, because that would have been a cool question to follow up. If it would be easy as well. That was the annoying thing, because you said it and I was like, oh man, I could have just asked them a couple of months later, what did you do afterwards? But again, anecdotally speaking, because I knew a lot of the participants and I was in very close contact with them throughout the study, and obviously that results in us speaking about their training, almost everyone increased training volume. So they either went back to something that could be like, I'm reluctant to classify things as low or medium or high volume, because that can be highly individual, but they definitely at least doubled the training volume they were doing. The very least, the majority of them, but put an asterisk to that. Sorry, I've come here super scientific with all my disclaimers and all the science BS, so I apologize.
Yeah, you're good. Well,
I like how you're working in your anecdotes too and your observations. That's really helpful. And honestly, that jives with what I've observed either in my own training or athletes that I've coached. Is usually by the time you're done with this, you're done. And you want to move back towards something that feels more preparatory in nature, that's more reppy, and where the volume is increased. And that makes a lot of sense. And a lot of things that Mike and I have been dabbling with recently, looking at that and how do you sequence those things. There's definitely a shelf life to strategies. And I think it's interesting. And the other aspect is just asking people in the future too, like what things were you doing prior to a minimum dose intervention? If someone was coming into it with very low volumes to begin with, it may not be that novel, versus someone who came in and they're doing 20 hard sets a week and now they're doing 3. That's pretty substantial. And that also could explain why they saw why they could see a rapid drop off in strength too. So that's where it gets like really relative. It'd be very interesting to look at research like that in the future,
Yep. And that's also one of the limitations of this project, is that, hey, maybe this just acted as a peaking block for a lot of them. I know personally, again, that some of them did hit all-time PRs, and that was really cool to see. But I also know that some of them, hey, if you take me and test me next week, I'm not going to best my all-time deadlift. But if we do 6 weeks of singles and back off sets and I pull all the volume and all my loved lat pull downs and test supported machine rows, if you pull all that and just have me do SBD or just BD or whatever, I'll probably hit a massive PR when comparing to my pre-test, right? It may not be an all-time PR. I may do 265 kilos on the deadlift next week, and then 6 weeks later do a 285 deadlift, which is just a 2.5 kilo all-time PR, but it will be a 20 kilo PR on paper. So that's an important limitation. But that's where the triangulation of the interview and intervention data came. And that's why it was nice to speak with all these great coaches, because I was like, hey, they said something similar and they had experienced increases in their own or their athletes training with such an approach or such a concept, right? Because it's not a set in stone approach. We didn't come up with the magic formula. And that was another takeaway from this project. Hey, this is exploratory research. We laid a foundation for other researchers to do hypothesis testing on top of that, and for lifters to be like, wow, this is something I could potentially experiment with, play around with different variables, see how low I can push my own training volume, not necessarily do 3 sessions a week and SBD the way we did it exactly on those training protocols.
Yeah. Our twins were born a couple of years ago. I did a probably close to 6-week period of training that is similar in terms of like it's kind of minimum training time, though. So my situation was such that I found I could get away from 15-minute training sessions, like maybe 2 or 3 15-minute sessions a day. So I didn't go in the direction of singles, though. For me, it was important to say, like, in and out in 15 minutes would mean I would need to warm up quickly. I need to do as many work sets as I could cram in 10 minutes or something like that, and then get out. So there was like this effort to keep working weights low so that you could warm up quickly, selecting exercises that didn't require a whole lot of setup, that didn't require a whole lot of weight. So it was like split squats and things of that nature for rest intervals, higher rep sets, kind of working on the same density. And it was fine. I'd have to go back and look and see what the result was in terms of strength maintained, if that's even the ideal metric in a situation like that. But it seemed fine. And when I came back to normal training, I didn't really have a big break-in period like other training breaks have had in the past. That was kind of my own sort of foray into that space. And John, I know that you've had seems a couple people recently who seem to push in the direction of less training getting us better responses. You always start out with what you think is going to work fast. And then it isn't ideal. Maybe the lifter feels a little bit beat up. So you reduce training volume, that goes a little bit better. And you just kind of keep pulling that thread. You keep following that trail. And it's taken you to some pretty, I don't know, it seems like pretty crazy low training volumes in terms of what's actually productive for that athlete. Do you want to talk about any of that?
So it's really interesting. I was just having a discussion with an athlete I was writing training for, and I don't want to go too much into the numbers on like stress index and things that we tend to look at RTS, but I was writing his training and I said, I'm looking at this and I'm saying to myself, I think we probably need to take out a squat slot, because I'm looking at the stress and I'm saying, how are you going to get a stimulus out of a set that's not that high RPE to hit the stress quota? And so I had a conversation with him and I'm like, I actually think that you would have a better quality session if you actually back off on the frequency. And if we start to feel like we're running out of room here, it's so easy to add another slot. So easy to add another couple sets on another day. I'd rather have you maximize the quality on one day. And actually that was a fantastic block for him. Another athlete where we were looking at his deadlift and we're like, why is this not moving? It came down to, when you start looking at the fatigue end of things, it's like, hey, let's remove it down to 1 time a week. Let's go down to 1 frequency of deadlift. That's it. And let's see how things go. His squat frequency was like 3 times a week. Deadlift went down to once. And here he is hitting lifetime PRs. And conceptually, you would think that someone in their training career ought to be increasing in volume and ought to be increasing in frequency. And that seems to be like the powerlifting mantra, right? That's the culture. Like we should be SBDing 4 times a week. But that isn't always the answer, because you run into roadblocks with the athlete's recovery. You run into roadblocks with the athlete being able to adapt to certain types of work. Not all lifters can be hitting single at 9 RPE or 9.5, do a minimum dose training like that. Not every lifter will benefit from that strategy. And so that's the kind of thing that you have to be thinking about is, what is it that the athlete tends to recover the most from? And what seems to be the roadblock right now? Is the roadblock they're not getting enough technique practice in? Is the roadblock that they're just not recovering by the time they go into the next session, proximity to future sessions? And then that's where conceptually you can say, why do we have to increase volume? What happens if we do a cycle where we pull back? One of the things I tell my lifters is, I think that there's probably a place of the maximum amount of stress that you could tolerate in a training week and still get better, right? Like we've heard that like MRV, we've heard it called a couple of different things. They'll just call it maximum stress. That's probably the maximum that you can tolerate from and recover sufficiently enough by the next session that you could take some type of increase. So if we use that as like a way to define it, we probably can't do that all year, right? Because we probably are going to run into periods of time. You're a human being, you're an open system, like all these things are happening in your life. You're probably not going to get 9 hours of sleep every single night, eat all the same macros that you need to hit. Life's just not going to give all of that to you on a silver platter. And so, but in a period of time where, let's say we're peaking into a meet, maybe you can get your life together for 6 weeks. Maybe you can shove a couple of things aside and you could get your sleep in and do whatever you need to do. And yeah, maybe it makes sense to run at that run rate. But at other times in the year, hey, you're going on vacation. Hey, you've got this going on. Maybe we need to head more toward the minimum effective range. And that's why I think your research is really important, because it does, more than anything, it gives people the excuse to say sometimes less is more and not be afraid to do that.
Yeah. And to touch on that and Mike's example as well, if we take another step back and take our eyes slightly off powerlifting performance and say, okay, you are on holiday. You don't really want to find a powerlifting gym and hit singles or AMRAPs or squat, bench, deadlift because you're spending time with your family and all you have access to is a hotel gym. There's, if we look at the literature as a whole, single set training for strength seems to be quite effective. And if you are doing at least enough to maintain your muscle mass and be active, as also Mike alluded to, your transition back to powerlifting training after your holiday or your break will be much easier. And we had a study recently where we looked at data for over 15,000 participants from a gym chain in the Netherlands, actually, called Fit20. Their whole business model is they cater to busy professionals who only train once per week for 20 minutes per week. And all they do is 4 to 6 repetition sets to momentary failure. So to the point where they attempt another rep and they can't get it, on 6 exercises: chest press, leg press, shoulder press, a few exercises, a few machine-based exercises with a professional on top of them pushing them to failure. And they do just that one 20-minute session a week. And we had data for over 7 years for 15,000 people. And for the first 1 or 2 years, they saw increases around 50 to 60% over baseline. Now, and then it plateaued and still went up a bit. I'm typing simultaneously because we're doing a similar study now where we're looking at the openpowerlifting.org data set, not we, another group, and I had the chance of giving some helping out a bit. But just because I'm blabbering now, just 20 minutes a week was enough for them to see increases. Obviously, they weren't powerlifters, but they saw increases with 20 minutes a week for 1 to 2 years. So if you're somebody who's going on holiday, if you have access to any sort of resistance, even if it's your own body weight, doing a few sets close to failure will at least maintain your gains and will make coming back to training much, much easier. So let alone doing singles and doing SBD, right? So that's really helpful for me as a lifter and as a coach to have in mind that, hey, just do something, keep the intensity of effort high. So as a student of Dr. James and Dr. Fisher, I cannot use intensity to name load, but rather to name effort. So if you keep your proximity to failure short, then yeah, you're going to be fine, even if you just do a couple of things. Mike, you did isometrics for quite some time, right?
Yeah, that was around the last move that we had was during COVID, and all the gyms were shut down. I knew this going into it. I set up a training kit that I could pack away my suitcase and do in a living room or something like that. I had a couple of band setups so I could do band resisted body weight stuff, band resisted split squats, band resisted push-ups, and also some tie down straps that I would use for isometric training. My thought was the band resisted stuff was good for repetition based exercise, but you still couldn't get like really high tension, especially in lengthened positions. So the isometrics were supposed to provide some high tension training in those longer muscle length. And I found that was slightly better than what I had done in the past, which is just band resisted training. So it turns out I move every couple of years, and lots of times this is a significant training disruption for a couple of months. So I'm getting practice at coping with that. The kind of first time I dealt with that was I did band resisted only, and that was okay, but I lost quite a bit of strength. With band resisted plus isometrics, I still lost strength, but it wasn't as much. And then this most recent time, I had the benefit of a flywheel, which, if I'm being totally honest, I don't think helped things as much as I expected it to. I expected it to maintain my strength quite well. But if I was to go through another series of 2 months without a gym and do that like starting now, I think I would go back to the band resisted and isometrics. Nice to have a flywheel for certain types of training, but I was hopeful that it would generate the high tension in lengthened joint configurations, but it didn't do that as much as I wanted it to. It's a bit hard to explain, I think, and I'm still trying to marshal my word on how to explain what I'm getting at, but it wasn't so effective for the high tension strength type of training, but it seemed to be really good at metabolic kinds of training, like taking fit to failure. It's basically a built-in drop set. So you can do some very metabolically demanding training on a flywheel. But anyway, this is perhaps a digression, but the things I've been learning about that 4 people care about.
No,
Sorry. I was going to add just some anecdote to that. So I had, after Mike's travel, I had a lifter who had to move cross country, and I was like, oh, that was a cool technique that Mike used. And let's try to replicate some of that, because he was moving cross country. He was basically going to continue driving the entire way. And he basically would park his moving van, get out, and do these isometric squat, bench, and deadlift with a suspension trainer. So he gets done with all of that. We do some of the band stuff too. He gets back, and yeah, strength is down. And it's what you would expect, right? Like, for someone who hasn't touched a barbell in almost close to 2 weeks, you'd expect strength to be down. But what was really interesting to me was the next block that we did, we hit all-time PRs. And I just couldn't put my finger on it, because we weren't doing things that were really all that different. And that's why I go back to my question to you before, Dr. Pack, of I wonder what people were doing before and what they did after. Because I think a lot of that matters. Just to add also my own anecdote about flywheel, I had a period of time where I was traveling across country over 2 weeks. I only had 3 training sessions, 30 minutes in length. And I went to complete momentary failure on the flywheel, doing flywheel squats and deadlift. And ended up getting sick the second week. I had intended to go to the gym, but it is what it is. Get home, start my next development block, and I go, I only lost about 6 or 7% D1RM. That's about normal from what I would expect after a pivot and going into a new development block. And I thought that was really interesting for me. And when I think back to where probably some of my limitations lie, it actually is in some of that metabolic stuff. So I see where Mike's coming from, of trying to piece together like how all of these strategies could be useful. I think max force production, isometrics in a lengthened position, man, they're great. If you can get your hands on a barbell, I would totally do the minimal effective dose training. Take me to a single at a 9.5, do a couple of back offs, be done, and get out of the gym. If I had that ability, if I didn't, I'd probably then move toward like isometrics and a combination of that and a flywheel. And I feel like you get a pretty good bang for your buck there.
For sure. And it's really refreshing to hear that. And I think COVID, the period of COVID, where especially for people that were working with lifters and had that access to people that ended up going from training in a gym with a lot of weight, the barbell, to all of a sudden doing whatever at home. I think anecdotally, we did see, I expected a lot of people to lose a lot of strength. And okay, if you haven't put a heavy weight on your back for 2 months or 3 or even more, it's expected that things are going to feel a bit rough. But the people that did maintain some sort of lifting, even if that was bodyweight training, even if it was one dumbbell to failure and some goblet squats and whatever, anecdotally speaking, I saw them coming back to the gym, and within a few weeks, boop, back to normal, if not better than before, which was crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, a lot of this points back to the sensitivity to training being a thing, and needing to include a sufficient amount of training variety. Of course, you can't neglect the other side of variety is specificity, and that's obviously important. And I think this day and age, we don't have to convince anybody that specific training is important in powerlifting. But I think the other side of the coin is variety, that if you just never include anything that's significantly different, then there does seem to be this desensitization type of effect. And at least that's how it looks to me from a coaching standpoint. You have people that get away from the competition lifts for a block and then come back and set all time. That's been a fairly consistent experience among trained powerlifters in my coaching practice. But even for myself over the years, I've even had periods where I would get injured and be unable to squat or deadlift. So you spend a lot of time doing single leg work, and then you come back to powerlifting training, and within 1 or 2 blocks, you set an all-time PR. That it's difficult to attribute that directly to the training that happened before, but you do all these other blocks back to back to back and don't at all-time PRs. It's hard to imagine that, that was just going to happen anyway. Maybe, but it's kind of weird that it keeps happening this way.
It is an interesting observation. It's a shame that we're not able to test all those things a bit more formally, because it's not like there's funding for powerlifting research and we can only do so many studies per year pro bono, but it's difficult to also convince powerlifters to participate in studies. But it would be really cool to explore all these concepts and observations we've made, because you're right. I've seen that with people's training and my own training. They do something that you expect is not going to benefit their strength whatsoever, like taking a week or 2 or more away from the power lifts and do whatever, maybe very unstructured hypertrophy training. And then they come back and they hit all-time PRs. And you're like, God damn, like you weren't hitting all-time PRs before when we were following a strict structure and everything was planned to a T, and now you are. Why?
And what's interesting to me is, like, you hear this in some of the powerlifters who've been around the block. The powerlifters who remember the days of quote unquote off-season bodybuilding work being the thing that we do. And probably the reason we lost you, Dr. Pack, the things that you would hear people say that, the meet didn't go the way you wanted to. Your last season didn't go the way you wanted to. You need to push your off-season harder. You need to do your bodybuilding stuff harder. And somehow that gets dismissed when we think about the principles of exercise science and we think about specificity. We're like, that can't possibly work because of X, Y, and Z. But there's enough people who have done this to say that there is at least a reason why, if you're in a situation where that seems like a good idea, you shouldn't be afraid of it. Same thing with minimal effective dose. If you're in a situation where you just had a kid, you're moving, whatever it is, hey, there's some research that suggests that, hey, if nothing else, you retain your strength. That's not bad. That's a good thing. If you're retaining your strength, you're doing a whole lot right.
Give it a go. Play around with it. Worst case scenario, you don't lose gains.
Keep an eye on how things go in the 1 to 2 blocks afterwards as well.
Yeah.
That might be instructive. Guys, man, this is a really enjoyable conversation. I really like training with you. If people want to get in touch with you, how do we do that?
So if people want to read the studies that I mentioned, they can do that if they type minimum dose one word .training in their browser. That will take them to a website that includes all the studies I mentioned. Getting in touch with me via Instagram would be the best way. My username is Dr.Dr_PAK, because all the other variations were not available. And yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure and honor. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, same here. All right, guys. Thanks again for the conversation. Thanks everybody for watching and listening. We'll see you next time.